What if the only person who could save you was the one the world taught you to fear? Tonight, we dive into a world where rejection becomes destiny, where two broken souls discover that sometimes being cast aside is the first step toward finding where you truly belong. This is the story of Lyra, who begged for bread and found a kingdom, of Kale, who chose exile and discovered his throne, of love that bloomed in the ashes of abandonment and power that rose from the depths of despair. If you're ready to feel every desperate heartbeat, every moment of recognition, every impossible touch that changes everything, hit subscribe, because this story will remind you that sometimes the most beautiful things grow in the darkest places. Let the story begin. The cold mud seeped through the holes in her worn boots, but Lyra barely felt the physical discomfort. The humiliation burned far hotter. Kneeling before the grey stone bakery, her trembling hands extended in supplication as words tumbled out like broken fragments. "Please, can I work for just a piece of bread? I know how to cook, I can clean, I can do anything." The sound of rain mixed with cruel laughter as the crowd gathered, their voices cutting through the storm like sharpened blades. "Look at her," sneered the baker's wife, her apron pristine white against Lyra's mud-stained rags. "The rejected Omega thinks she deserves charity." More laughter rippled through the crowd, and Lyra felt each sound like a physical blow. "I'm not even Omega," she thought desperately. "I'm nothing. Not Alpha, not Beta, not Omega, just nothing." Her fingers dug into the wet earth as another stone struck her shoulder, the impact reverberating through her hollow frame. Then the laughter died. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the mockery had been, and Lyra felt the air itself change, charged, dangerous, alive with predatory energy. A shadow fell across her, massive and dark, and she smelled him before she saw him. Pine forests after lightning strikes, winter wind over sharp peaks, and something wild and untamed that made her wolf, what little remained of it, whimper in recognition. When she finally raised her eyes, the world tilted. Golden eyes stared down at her, not with pity or disgust, but with something far more dangerous, understanding. Kyle stood like a mountain given human form, his dark hair slicked with rain, scars mapping stories of survival across visible skin. The crowd had stumbled backward, fear replacing their earlier bravado, and in the sudden quiet, his voice cut through the storm. "You said you can work. Prove it." The cabin defied every expectation Lyra had harbored during their silent climb. Where she'd imagined a crude shelter fit for an exile, she found something that felt deliberately crafted. Log walls that gleamed with care, windows that caught and held the dying light, a garden where herbs grew in careful rows despite the wild mountain air. Kyle moved through the space with unconscious familiarity, lighting a fire that crackled to life as if it had been waiting for his return. "This is beautiful," Lyra whispered, then immediately regretted speaking. But Kyle didn't respond with the harsh dismissal she expected. Instead, he paused in his movements, something almost vulnerable flickering across his features before the walls slammed back into place. She found herself studying him in the firelight, the way his hands moved with unexpected gentleness as he prepared simple food, the careful distance he maintained, as if proximity itself was dangerous. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but charged with unspoken questions. Lyra's eyes wandered the room, cataloguing details that revealed layers she hadn't expected. Books on herb lore and ancient pack histories, a half-finished carving of a wolf mid-howl, and most telling of all, a torn photograph tucked behind other papers. A younger Kyle, standing beside people who shared his dark hair and golden eyes. Family, she realized, who clearly no longer claimed him. "You don't have to be afraid," Kyle said suddenly, his voice rougher than she'd expected. "I won't hurt you." But there was something in his tone that suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as her. Lyra found herself stepping closer to the fire and by extension closer to him, drawn by a warmth that had nothing to do with the flames. "I'm not afraid," she said, and realized with surprise that it was true. "I'm just trying to understand why you helped me." His golden eyes met hers across the flickering light, and for a moment the careful distance between them felt fragile as spun glass. "Because," he said simply, "I know what it feels like to beg for scraps in a world that's decided you're worthless." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with shared pain and the dangerous possibility of healing. Lyra discovered that her hands remembered skills her mind had almost forgotten. The broken shutter that had hung crooked for months yielded to her touch, the herb garden welcomed her careful tending, and the simple act of preparing food became something approaching meditation. She worked with focused intensity, pouring unspoken gratitude into every task, while Kyle maintained his careful distance, observing but not interfering, present but not intrusive. "My mother taught me about herbs," Lyra said, as she arranged dried chamomile and lavender into careful bundles. The words came softly, tentatively, as if testing whether this fragile piece could hold the weight of memory. She said that healing grows best in wild places, where it has to fight to survive. Her hands stilled on the plants, and Kyle saw the moment grief flickered across her features like shadow over water. Something in her careful movements, the way she handled each herb with reverent attention, stirred memories Kyle had buried deep. His own mother, tending a similar garden before everything fell apart. Before he learned that being different meant being dangerous, that power without control was a curse that could destroy everything you touched. He found himself speaking before he could stop the words. "She sounds wise." The admission felt like offering a piece of himself he'd kept locked away. The comfortable rhythm of their shared silence was broken by a sound that made Cale's entire body tense, the distant howl of wolves, but wrong somehow, too organized, too purposeful. Lyra looked up from her work, catching the sudden change in his posture, the way his hands had clenched into fists. "What is it?" she asked. But his face had already shifted into the mask of dangerous calm she'd glimpsed in the village. "Patrol," he said simply, but Lyra heard the layers beneath the word: history, conflict, the suggestion that their mountain sanctuary might not be as safe as it seemed. As if summoned by the distant howls, thunder rumbled overhead, and the first drops of rain began to fall. Kyle moved to secure the windows, his movements sharp with tension, and Lyra realized that whatever piece they'd found was about to be tested. The nightmare hit Kyle like a physical assault, dragging him back to the stone chamber where they'd tried to force his wolf to surface through pain and humiliation. In his dream, he was 18 again, strapped to cold metal, while voices above him debated whether more electricity or silver would finally break whatever was wrong inside him. His body thrashed against invisible restraints, low growls escaping his throat as his unconscious mind fought battles his waking self had learned to bury. Lyra woke to the sound of his anguish, not just the physical sounds of distress, but something deeper that called to every protective instinct she possessed. "He's hurting," she realized, "the way I hurt when the dreams come." Without thinking, she slipped from her makeshift bed and padded to his door, her heart hammering as she listened to the broken words spilling from his lips. "Not broken. Not broken. Please." "Kyle," she whispered, pushing the door open slowly. The sight that greeted her made her chest tighten with recognition. He lay tangled in sheets soaked with sweat, his powerful body contorting against enemies only he could see. She moved closer, drawn by instinct older than thought, and reached out to touch his shoulder. The moment her skin met his, something electric passed between them, and his eyes snapped open. For a heartbeat, he didn't recognize her. Golden eyes wild and dangerous, every muscle coiled for violence. Then awareness returned, and with it shame so profound it made Lyra's throat close in sympathy. "I'm sorry," he rasped, trying to pull away, but she didn't let him retreat. "Don't," she said firmly. "Don't apologize for surviving whatever they did to you." Her words hit him like a physical blow, and she saw the exact moment his carefully constructed walls began to crack. "They said I was broken," he whispered, the confession torn from somewhere deep and bleeding. "For 3 years, they tried everything to make my wolf surface. Every alpha before me had shifted by 16, but I—" His voice broke, and Lyra felt her own eyes fill with tears. "You're not broken," she said fiercely. "You're just different, and different isn't wrong." In the darkness of his room, with rain drumming against the windows, she shared her own secret. "I never shifted either, not once. Maybe we're both just waiting for the right moment." The conversation that began in darkness continued with dawn's arrival, and with it came revelations that reframed everything they thought they knew about themselves. Lyra spoke first, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was sharing. "My parents didn't die protecting territory. They were murdered because of what I am." The words hung in the air like smoke, and Kyle felt something cold settle in his chest as pieces of a larger puzzle began to align. "A bridge," Lyra continued, her eyes fixed on the dying embers. "That's what the old woman called me before she disappeared. Someone who can heal the deepest wounds, not just physical ones, but the trauma that breaks a shifter's connection to their wolf." She looked up at Kale then, and he saw ancient knowledge in her young eyes. "The alphas weren't rejecting me because I was worthless. They were rejecting me because I was too powerful, and they were afraid of what that meant." Kale's hands clenched as his own memories surged forward. Pieces of overheard conversations and fragments of whispered arguments finally making sense. "Guardians," he said slowly, his voice rough with dawning understanding. "They called my family line Guardians. I thought it was just tradition. But my grandmother, before she died, she said something about wolves who were meant to protect the bridges." His golden eyes met hers, and in them Lyra saw recognition blooming like fire. The implications crashed over them in waves. They hadn't found each other by accident. Their meeting was the culmination of bloodlines that had been kept apart for generations, families who had chosen fear over hope, tradition over evolution. "They knew," Lyra whispered, her voice filled with growing anger. "Our families knew what we were meant to be together, and they chose to let us suffer instead." The betrayal cut deep, but beneath it, something else was growing, a fierce determination that their pain wouldn't be for nothing. From his jacket, Kyle pulled out a letter he'd carried for years without understanding its significance. The paper was yellow with age, the seal bearing symbols neither of them recognized, but when Lyra touched it, she felt power humming beneath her fingers like a live wire. As they unfolded it together, words written in 2 different hands became clear. "When the bridge and guardian find each other, the old ways will crumble and a new age will dawn. May they have the courage to choose love over fear." The letter revealed more than just prophecy. It contained a map, drawn in fading ink, that seemed to pulse with life under Lyra's touch. Ancient symbols marked locations across the mountain ranges, and as they studied it together, the horrifying scope of the conspiracy became clear. "These are safe houses," Lyra whispered, her finger tracing the network of hidden symbols. "Places where others like us were supposed to find sanctuary, but they're all marked with crosses, which means they're all gone," Kyle finished, his voice heavy with the weight of realization. The systematic elimination of their kind hadn't been random persecution. It had been orchestrated extermination. Every bridge, every guardian, every pair that might have challenged the rigid hierarchy that kept alphas in power and the different ones cast out. "How many of us were there originally?" Lyra asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Kyle's hands shook as he pointed to a cluster of symbols near their current location. "This was my family's territory," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And this is where your parents died." The proximity wasn't coincidence. It was confirmation that their families had been eliminated in a coordinated strike. designed to prevent the prophecy from ever coming to pass. The knowledge hit them both like a physical blow, grief and rage warring in their chests. But as they absorbed the magnitude of what had been stolen from them, something else emerged from the ancient text. Hope, written in careful strokes between the lines of tragedy. "Look," Lyra said, her voice gaining strength as she read aloud, "The union of bridge and guardian shall not be prevented by death or distance, for love transcends the boundaries that fear creates. When they find each other, all that was lost shall be restored, and the cycle of healing shall begin anew." The words had barely left her lips when the sound that had haunted Cale's nightmares filled the air, organized howls, closer now, and accompanied by the mechanical hum of vehicles. The patrol wasn't just passing through, they were converging on the cabin with purpose. Kyle was on his feet instantly, every muscle tensed for violence, but it was Lyra who spoke the truth they both felt. "They know. Somehow, they know we found each other." The soldiers moved with military precision, surrounding the cabin in a formation designed to prevent escape. Through the windows, Lyra caught glimpses of silver-modified weapons and armor that gleamed with lethal purpose. But it was Kyle's reaction that truly frightened her. Not fear, but resignation, as if this moment had been inevitable since the day he'd chosen exile over submission. "There's something you need to know," Kyle said, his voice steady despite the chaos approaching their sanctuary. "My wolf didn't fail to surface because I was broken. It didn't surface because it was protecting something too powerful for my teenage body to contain." His golden eyes found hers across the small space, and Lyra felt the air itself change, charged with electricity that made her skin tingle. "I think it was waiting for you." The confession hung between them as the first shots shattered their windows, silver bullets embedding in the log walls with sounds like thunder. Instinct overrode thought, and Lyra reached for Kyle at the same moment he reached for her. The instant their skin met, palm to palm, fingers interlocking, the world exploded into sensation that defied every law of physics she thought she understood. Power erupted from their joined hands, like lightning made manifest. A surge of energy so pure and overwhelming that it short-circuited every electronic device within a mile radius. The attacking soldiers' equipment failed simultaneously, their vehicles dying mid-advance, their communications reduced to static. But it was more than just electromagnetic interference, it was transformation. The very air around them shimmering with potential as their wolves finally answered the call they'd been waiting lifetimes to hear. Lyra felt her consciousness expand beyond the boundaries of her human form, touching something vast and ancient and utterly right. Through the connection with Cale, she experienced his wolf for the first time, not broken, but magnificent, a creature of such power and nobility that it took her breath away. And he, through her, felt the healing light that lived in her soul, warm and golden, and capable of mending things that had seemed permanently shattered. "We're not broken," she whispered, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated in the very stones of the mountain. "We never were. We were just incomplete." The soldiers outside had stopped their advance, staring in shock at the phenomenon beyond their understanding, but Lyra and Cale barely noticed. They were too busy discovering that when they touched with intention, they could reshape reality itself. They moved through the forest, like creatures born of shadow and starlight, their newly awakened bond allowing them to communicate without words, to anticipate each other's movements with preternatural precision. Behind them, the soldiers struggled to follow, their heavy equipment useless in terrain that seemed to shift and change to protect the fleeing pair. What they didn't know was that the mountain itself was responding to Lyra and Cale's presence, ancient magic stirring in stone and root. "This way," Cale spoke directly into her mind, his mental voice as clear as if he'd spoken aloud. The sensation should have been jarring, but instead it felt like coming home, like a conversation they'd been having across lifetimes. Lyra found herself responding in kind, her thoughts flowing toward his with ease. "There's someone watching us. not a soldier, someone familiar. From the shadows between ancient pines stepped a figure that made them both freeze in recognition and wariness. Magnus emerged like a ghost from their shared nightmares, but instead of the enemy they'd expected, his weathered face showed relief so profound it was painful to witness. "Thank the old gods," he breathed. "I thought I was too late." This was the man who had trained Kale in secret during his years of exile, who had whispered stories of the ancient ways when the rest of the world had forgotten. Magnus moved with the careful efficiency of someone who had spent decades evading detection, leading them through hidden paths that existed in the spaces between mapped trails. As they climbed higher into the mountain's heart, he spoke in urgent whispers. "The prophecy has a second part, one that your families never wanted you to know. The union of Bridge and Guardian doesn't just heal the individual. It can restore the severed connection between humanity and the wild, but only if you're willing to pay the price." The revelation hit them like a physical blow, and through their bond, Lyra felt Kale's instant understanding of what that price might be. "Our individual selves," she said, the words torn from somewhere deep and terrified. "Complete union means we stop being separate people. We become something new, something that's never existed before." The choice they faced was impossible: save their people by sacrificing the love they'd just discovered, or preserve their individual connection while others continued to suffer. But Magnus wasn't finished with his revelations. "There's more," he said, his voice heavy with knowledge that had cost him everything to preserve. "The current Alpha, the one leading the hunt for you, he's not just maintaining tradition. He's your brother, Kale, and he was there the night Lyra's parents died." The sanctuary existed outside normal space, a pocket of the world where time moved differently, and the veil between human and wolf grew thin. Here, surrounded by crystals that hummed with ancestral memory, Magnus revealed the full scope of what they faced. Maps covered every surface, showing the locations of hidden communities, other rejects who had found each other in the margins of society, building new ways of living beyond the traditional pack structure. "Your brother didn't just kill your parents by chance," Magnus said, his words falling like stones into still water. "He's been systematically hunting every Bridge and Guardian pair for the past decade, convinced that your union will destroy the natural order." The old man's eyes held depths of pain that spoke of personal loss. "He killed my daughter too. She was a Bridge, mated to a Guardian from the Eastern Territories. They died, believing they were alone." Lyra felt Kyle's anguish through their bond. Not just the betrayal of family, but the weight of all those who had died to prevent what they now represented. "How many?" she asked, though her heart already knew the answer was too many. "How many pairs like us have been murdered to maintain their fear?" The systematic nature of the persecution made her stomach turn, but also kindled a fierce determination she hadn't known she possessed. Through the crystal networks in the cave, Magnus showed them something that made their hearts race with equal parts hope and terror. Other survivors, hidden across the continent, waiting for a sign that it was safe to emerge from shadow. "If you complete the union," he explained, "your combined power will awaken every dormant Bridge and Guardian bloodline, but the process will fundamentally change who you are. You'll become a singular entity, more powerful than anything that's ever existed, but you'll lose the individual love that brought you together." The choice stretched before them like a chasm with no bridge. Remain themselves and preserve the precious, fragile love they'd discovered, or sacrifice their individual identity to free others like them from centuries of persecution. "There has to be another way," Kyle said, his mental voice tight with desperation. "There has to be a path that doesn't require us to die to ourselves." But even as he spoke the words, they all knew that prophecies rarely offered convenient alternatives. As if summoned by their anguish, the sound of approaching vehicles echoed through the mountains. Magnus's face went pale as he checked his monitoring devices. "They've found us," he whispered. "Your brother's forces are less than an hour away, and they're not coming to negotiate. The moment of choice was upon them, but now they would have to make it under fire, with the lives of everyone in the sanctuary hanging in the balance. The first wave of attackers discovered that Magnus's sanctuary was protected by more than just hidden location and difficult terrain. As they approached the cave entrance, the mountain itself seemed to come alive, shifting passages and sealing tunnels in response to hostile intent. But technology and determination proved stronger than ancient defenses, and soon the sound of drilling and explosives echoed through the crystal chambers. "We can't let them reach the others," Lyra said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they faced. Through their bond, she felt Kale's wolf pacing, eager for battle, but constrained by the knowledge that violence alone wouldn't solve their fundamental problem. "If we use our full power together, we might be able to stop them," but she didn't need to finish the thought. They both understood that drawing on their complete connection risked the very loss of self they were trying to avoid. Magnus pressed weapons into their hands, not the modern firearms their enemies carried, but ancient blades that hummed with the same energy that flowed through the crystal networks. "These were forged for your bloodlines," he said urgently. "They'll channel your power without forcing the complete union. But you'll need to work in perfect harmony, and you'll need to trust each other absolutely." The first soldiers breached the outer chamber just as Kyle and Lyra found their rhythm. Moving like dancers in a choreography written in their DNA, they flowed around each other in patterns that seemed impossible. Where one was vulnerable, the other provided protection. Where one struck, the other was already moving to the next target. Their bond allowed them to share not just thoughts, but reflexes, creating a fighting style that was beautiful and terrifying in its perfection. But as they fought, something unexpected happened. Other figures emerged from the deeper tunnels, the survivors Magnus had been protecting, bridge and guardian pairs who had found each other against all odds and chosen love over the safety of hiding. They moved to join the battle, and Lyra realized with a shock that they weren't alone in their struggle. "We're not the only ones," she gasped, watching a woman whose touch could heal wounds fight beside a man whose presence made their enemies' weapons malfunction. "The bloodlines, they're not as dead as everyone believed." The revelation gave them new strength, but it also raised the stakes exponentially. This wasn't just about their personal choice anymore. It was about the survival of an entire hidden community that had found ways to love and live beyond the traditional boundaries. As Kale's brother's voice echoed through the caverns, demanding surrender, Lyra and Kale exchanged a look that needed no words. They would fight for more than just themselves. In the midst of chaos, Magnus made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden within the deepest pages of the prophecy, written in script so faded it was nearly invisible, lay words that had been overlooked for generations. His weathered hands trembled as he deciphered text that seemed to shift and change under his gaze. The union need not consume the lovers, but transform the world around them. When Bridge and Guardian choose love over power, their bond becomes a beacon that awakens others without requiring sacrifice of self. "Lyra, Kyle!" Magnus's mental call cut through the battle like a blade of pure hope. Through their connection, they felt his excitement, his desperate urgency to share what he'd found. There is another way. The prophecy was deliberately mistranslated. Complete union was never the requirement. Conscious choice to remain individual while serving something greater is the true path. The revelation hit them like lightning, but around them the battle was intensifying. Kale's brother had entered the sanctuary himself, and the family resemblance was unmistakable. The same golden eyes, the same powerful build, but where Kyle had found peace in exile, his brother radiated the desperate control of someone who had built his identity on maintaining a system that was crumbling around him. "Stand down, Kyle," his brother's voice echoed through the chamber, amplified by technology that made the crystals themselves ring with feedback. "You don't understand what you're unleashing. The old ways exist for a reason. Chaos follows change, and chaos destroys everything we've built. But as he spoke, Lyra saw something else in his expression. Not just conviction, but fear. Fear that he'd been wrong, that the murders he'd committed had been for nothing. Through their bond, Lyra felt Kyle's response forming. Not words, but something deeper. Forgiveness tinged with determination, love that refused to be poisoned by betrayal. "The old ways weren't built to last, brother," Kyle called back, his voice carrying across the battle without technological amplification. "They were built on fear, and fear always devours itself eventually. We're offering something better, a choice to grow instead of a demand to conform." The other Bridge and Guardian pairs had formed a protective circle around the main crystal formation, their combined presence creating a harmony that made the air itself sing with possibility. Lyra realized that this was what the prophecy had truly meant, not the sacrifice of two individuals to save many, but the conscious choice of many individuals to create something larger than the sum of their parts. The final truth emerged not in words, but in action, as Kyle's brother made his choice clear by ordering his soldiers to target the non-combatants hiding in the deeper chambers. The casual cruelty of it, the willingness to murder innocent people to maintain his vision of order, shattered any remaining illusion that this conflict could be resolved through negotiation. This was war between worldviews, and only one could survive. "He's not going to stop," Lyra realized, her mental voice heavy with grief for the man Kyle's brother might have been under different circumstances. "He can't stop. Admitting we're right means admitting that everyone he's killed died for nothing." Through their bond, she felt Kyle's heart breaking, but also his resolve crystallizing into something unbreakable. But as the soldiers advanced on the sanctuary's heart, something unprecedented began to happen. The other Bridge and Guardian pairs, inspired by Lyra and Kyle's example, began to drop their own barriers, allowing their connections to deepen and strengthen. The effect was multiplicative. Each pair that chose openness over protection amplified the power available to all the others, creating a network of healing energy that spread through the crystal formations like wildfire. The mountain responded to their combined will, passages shifting to protect the innocent while channeling the attackers toward the main chamber where the united pairs waited. But it was more than just tactical advantage. The awakening of so many dormant bloodlines sent ripples across the continent, touching every hidden community, every isolated individual who had thought themselves alone and broken. "Do you feel that?" Lyra whispered in wonder, her consciousness expanded beyond anything she'd thought possible. Through the network of awakened pairs, she could sense others stirring to life, teenagers who had been told they were defective, finally feeling their wolves stir, adults who had given up hope, discovering that their gifts had been dormant, not dead. Kyle's brother felt it too, and the terror in his eyes was unmistakable as he realized the magnitude of what was happening. His carefully controlled world was cracking apart, revealing the vast diversity of what shifter kind could become when freed from rigid hierarchies. "Stop this!" he screamed, his voice breaking with desperation. "You don't know what you're doing. There are reasons for the old ways." But it was too late to stop what they had started. The awakening was spreading beyond their ability to control or contain, and for the first time in generations, the rejected and the different were discovering that they were neither broken nor alone. The moment of perfect choice arrived like dawn, breaking over a landscape that had known only darkness. Faced with the spreading awakening and his brother's increasing desperation, Kyle made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of meeting violence with violence, he opened his bond with Lyra completely, not to merge their identities, but to become a conduit for something larger than either of them alone. "This is who we choose to be," Lyra said, her voice carrying across the chamber with harmonics that resonated in the very stones. Not gods, not rulers, not saviors, just ourselves, choosing to love in a world that told us love was impossible. As she spoke, their combined energy flowed outward, but instead of overwhelming those it touched, it invited them to join something beautiful and voluntary. The transformation that followed defied every prophecy and prediction. Rather than losing themselves in union, Lyra and Kale discovered that perfect partnership meant becoming more individual, not less, their unique gifts amplified rather than diluted by their connection. Lyra's healing light grew stronger, more precise, capable of mending not just individual trauma, but generational wounds. Kyle's protective presence expanded, creating a space where others could safely explore their own dormant potential. Kyle's brother, witnessing the reality of what he'd spent his life trying to prevent, faced a choice that would define his soul. The old fear suggested he should fight to the death rather than admit error, but the love radiating from his brother and Lyra offered something he'd forgotten existed: the possibility of redemption without destruction. "I was wrong," he whispered, the words torn from the deepest part of his being. "I was so afraid of losing control that I forgot what control was supposed to protect." The surrender of the attacking force marked not victory, but transformation. Soldiers who had come to destroy found themselves welcomed into a vision of community they'd never imagined possible. The rigid hierarchy that had defined shifter society for generations didn't collapse. It evolved, becoming a network where strength supported rather than dominated, where difference was celebrated rather than eliminated. But the most profound change was in Lyra and Kyle themselves. They had discovered that true union meant remaining completely themselves, while choosing to serve something greater than their individual desires. Their love became a foundation rather than a destination, the bedrock upon which they could build a future that honored both individual choice and collective well-being. Kale's brother knelt in the crystal chamber, not in defeat, but in recognition of a truth he'd spent decades trying to deny. The healing that flowed from Lyra's touch didn't erase his crimes, but transformed his understanding of them, allowing him to see the individuals behind each life he'd taken rather than the abstract threat he'd convinced himself they represented. "I can't undo what I've done," he said, tears cutting tracks through the dust of battle on his face, "but I can spend the rest of my life ensuring it never happens again." Across the continent, in hidden valleys and forgotten territories, the dormant stirred to life. A teenage girl in the eastern forests felt her wolf respond for the first time, not with violence, but with joy. A man who had lived 40 years believing himself broken discovered that his gift for soothing traumatized animals was exactly what his community needed. Each awakening added to the network, creating a web of connection that spanned geographical and social boundaries. The sanctuary became the first of many, places where the different could gather without fear, where bridge and guardian pairs could explore their potential without persecution, where new ways of living could be tested and refined. Magnus, no longer a keeper of hidden knowledge, but a teacher of open wisdom, helped establish schools where young shifters could learn about all the forms their gifts might take. The rigid pack structure didn't disappear overnight, but it began to evolve as those in power recognized that diversity created strength rather than weakness. Trade networks formed between traditional packs and the new communities, exchanges of knowledge and resources that benefited everyone. Some traditionalists remained resistant, but they became islands of old thinking in an ocean of change. At the center of it all, Lyra and Kale discovered that their love had become something unprecedented, not possessive or exclusive, but generative, creating space for others to find their own forms of connection. They chose to remain at the mountain sanctuary, not as rulers but as examples, showing that partnership could be both deeply personal and broadly transformative. The bakery stood at the heart of the new settlement, its windows golden with warmth and its door always open. Lyra moved through the space with practiced grace, her hands shaping dough, while her gift shaped the community around her, healing old wounds, helping newcomers find their place, teaching others that nourishment came in many forms. The bread she baked had become legendary, not for magical properties, but for the love baked into every loaf. "Remember when you thought you were only worth a piece of bread?" Kyle asked, watching her work with eyes that held 3 years of shared mornings, shared challenges, shared growth. His own role had evolved too, from protector to facilitator, helping design communities where everyone could contribute their unique gifts, where strength meant lifting others rather than standing over them. Lyra laughed, the sound rich with contentment that had been hard-won. "I never thought I was worth that much," she admitted. "I thought I was begging for charity. I didn't understand I was offering everything I had." Through the window, they could see the results of that offering. Children playing in streets where fear used to rule, adults learning skills they'd never been allowed to explore, communities thriving on principles of mutual support rather than dominance. A young woman approached the counter, her posture familiar in its defensive hunch, her clothes marking her as a recent arrival from one of the territories still resistant to change. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I heard you might have work. I can do anything. I just need—" Lyra and Kyle exchanged a look full of shared memory and infinite possibility. "You need a place to belong," Lyra said gently, coming around the counter to meet the newcomer's eyes. "And we need someone who understands that the most important work isn't about what you can do, it's about who you choose to become." The young woman's eyes filled with tears as she realized she had found not just employment, but home. And in that moment, watching another lost soul discover their worth, Lyra and Kale understood that their story had never really been about them at all. It had been about proving that love could create space for everyone, that strength could nurture rather than dominate, that sometimes the most important revolutions began with someone brave enough to ask for bread and someone wise enough to offer a seat at the table. A story of rejection transformed into belonging, of love that heals not just individuals but entire societies, and of the revolutionary power of choosing compassion over fear. Sometimes the greatest transformations begin with the smallest acts of courage, like asking for bread and being offered a kingdom.